A flight attendant acted aggressively toward a black CEO, but the CEO calmly turned the situation around, leaving the crew stunned and powerless. A flight attendant punched a black CEO in the mouth, thinking he could bully him mid-flight. He didn't realize the CEO was ready to defend himself and would use the armrest to turn the tables instantly. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when skill meets force. The briefcase struck the carpeted floor beneath seat 2A with a muted thud, followed by the slow, deliberate click of Dr. Eric Lender's seatbelt. His fingers lingered on the brushed metal buckle for a breath too long, composure masking tension. The overhead lights of Skyvale Flight 772 cast a soft, sterile glow across the business class cabin, but it did little to steady the quiet unease settling inside him. A pair of polished shoes stopped just short of his row. Eric glanced upward. The flight attendant standing before him was tall and broad-shouldered, with features too stern to be called neutral. His name tag read Marin Salvak, but it was his body language, not his name, that captured Eric's attention. Marin's arms were rigid at his sides, his jaw clenched as if grinding down something unsaid. His gaze swept over Eric, not with curiosity, but with something harder: scrutiny, disdain, calculation. For a moment, their eyes locked. Then Marin turned and pretended to adjust the overhead storage bin, though Eric noted there was nothing out of place. The gesture wasn't functional, it was a performance. Eric studied the man's posture. Not rushed, not distracted, just focused, too focused. He leaned back slowly into his seat, eyes narrowing. Something about that encounter unsettled him in a way that didn't show on the surface, but pressed inward like a quiet pressure drop before turbulence. He checked his watch out of habit. Still 15 minutes until taxi. His tablet rested on his lap, displaying the executive summary of Lendor Dynamics Behavioral AI Audit. It was encrypted, tied to a biometric key, and the chip carrying the full dataset was locked inside the briefcase now nestled under his seat. That chip held the power to derail a billion-dollar aviation contract and expose a major manipulation in passenger compliance algorithms. It was the reason Eric had flown out on such short notice. It was also the reason, perhaps, that he had received 2 anonymous alerts earlier in the week warning him not to board any Skyvale flight. He had deleted them without forwarding to security. That decision now returned in sharp flashes. The aisle began to fill with passengers, brief greetings, rustling bags, the soft clink of buckles sliding into place. But even amid that familiar boarding chaos, Eric felt oddly separate, isolated, like a line had been drawn beneath his feet, invisible to others but very real to him. From across the aisle, a male passenger quietly settled into 2B. Mid-30s, close-shaved hair, dressed casually but neatly. He opened a travel magazine and began flipping through without apparent interest. But Eric noticed something peculiar. The man's eyes flicked downward every so often, glancing toward Eric's briefcase with the same distracted repetition as someone checking a ticking clock. That glance wasn't idle. Eric's jaw tightened. A second thread. 2 men, neither speaking, both playing roles they weren't fully hiding. "Would you like a pre-flight drink?" Marin's voice returned, but not with warmth. He had circled back to Eric's row and was now speaking with a polished edge, politeness sheathed in something cooler. "Just water," Eric answered without looking up. "In a glass or a cup?" Marin asked too quickly. "A cup," Eric replied. Marin paused. "Very well." He left, but not before brushing his fingertips against Eric's shoulder as he turned. The contact was subtle, but unmistakably intentional. Eric inhaled slowly through his nose. This wasn't random rudeness. It was targeted, controlled. A few rows behind, someone coughed. Someone else laughed at a video on their phone. Normalcy clung to the air like a thin film, but Eric could already feel the mask peeling. He tapped the edge of his tablet, scrolling through briefing slides he no longer absorbed. His thoughts returned to the chip under his seat. A safeguard audit, a technological threat, an accountability tool worth more than the entire plane's manifest combined. Perhaps it had drawn more attention than expected. Perhaps he had underestimated the scale of opposition. A dull chime signaled the closing of the cabin doors. The captain's voice echoed through the overhead speaker, listing flight duration, destination, expected weather. Eric barely registered the words. His mind was focused on the silence between announcements, the space where planning happened. Across the aisle, the casually dressed man flipped another page without reading it. Eric glanced toward him once. The man didn't look back, but the tension in his posture suggested he expected to be watched. Their non-interaction was too practiced, as if they were both characters on opposite sides of a stage, waiting for the cue to begin. Marin walked past again, now checking seatbelts with mechanical efficiency. As he reached Eric, he slowed just enough to say, "You sure this is your seat?" People get confused sometimes. Eric turned his head deliberately. "2A is correct." Marin met his gaze once more, this time with the faintest smirk curling one side of his mouth. "Of course." He moved on. Eric didn't respond, but inside, something braced. He had been on hundreds of flights across dozens of carriers. He knew the difference between sharp service and sharpened intent. This wasn't turbulence in the sky. This was pressure on the ground, designed, deliberate. His fingers rested lightly on the briefcase under the seat. The metal felt cooler than it should. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the low hum of the engines settle around him. Calm wasn't just a habit, it was a weapon. Let them play their parts. Let them believe the stage was theirs. But he had not survived corporate sabotage, data breaches, and 4 acquisition wars by flinching at shadows. The plane jerked slightly as it taxied from the gate. Eric exhaled. The casually dressed man turned one last page. Marin adjusted a bin that didn't need adjusting. And somewhere behind the professional smiles, an unseen plan was already unfolding. What Eric didn't know was that someone on this aircraft had already marked him. The door sealed with a dull, pressurized thud, silencing the last rush of air from the jet bridge. In row 2, Eric Lindor shifted in his seat, eyes still locked on the seatback display before him. The hum of machinery ramping up beneath the fuselage was steady and familiar, but his mind remained unsettled, not by turbulence or altitude, but by the man standing 6 feet away. Marin Salvak. The flight attendant's posture was all precision on the surface, shoulders squared, walk measured, but there was something wrong in the rhythm. He didn't glance at passengers with the usual courtesy. His attention kept cutting sideways, lingering too long on certain rows. When his eyes returned to Eric, it was never idle curiosity. It was sharp, intentional. Eric noticed how Marin's fingers lingered on the overhead bin handle longer than necessary as he passed row 2 again. When their eyes met briefly, Marin offered nothing, not a nod, not a smile, just a flicker of something unreadable. Eric made a mental note. Flight crews didn't normally look at passengers like that unless something had already been said or planned. Across the aisle sat a man who hadn't moved much since boarding. He held a thin travel magazine open to a center spread of coastal resorts, but hadn't turned the page in 5 minutes. His name, according to the manifest Eric had glimpsed during his pre-trip security check, was Darren Velro. Brown jacket, charcoal slacks, wireframe glasses, everything about him looked low profile. But the glances told another story. 3 times now, Darren had measured the distance between himself and the briefcase tucked beneath Eric's seat. Not at Eric, not at the tray table, just the briefcase. The encrypted chip inside it, containing Lindor Dynamics behavioral AI compliance data, was housed in a titanium-secured case, undetectable to most, but perhaps not invisible to those trained to look. A rustle of fabric. Marin was moving again. This time, he stopped directly at Eric's row. His tone was light, but the words were anything but. "You sure this is your seat?" Sometimes people get confused. Eric didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, and met Marin's stare. 2A is correct. The pause stretched. Marin held the gaze for a second too long, a taut silence forming between them, as if the air was waiting to be sliced. Then came the smile. Not warm, not even functional. It was the bare minimum of expression, just enough to avoid a complaint, just sharp enough to carry a warning. "Right," Marin said softly. Then he moved on. The hum of conversation resumed around them, but quieter. A passenger, 2 rows back, adjusted his headphones, then took them off again. Another passenger feigned interest in the safety card, peeking between the seats. Everyone had heard it. Everyone had felt the dissonance. Eric turned back to his display, but the screen felt dim now, irrelevant. His eyes scanned the route maps absently, his mind calculating angles and contingencies. Something was not right. This wasn't just about a rude crew member. It was layered. Darren's sidelong glances. Marin's quiet provocations. The orchestration felt too exact. Disrupt, distract, disarm. The classic triad for a soft interference operation. Eric had seen it used in corporate espionage. Trigger a scene, remove the mark, extract the asset. Was that what this was? He reached subtly down, checking the briefcase lock with his fingertips. Secure. Still aligned. Still unopened. But his senses prickled. Marin returned once more, this time walking the aisle with eyes flicking right then left, like a man looking for a cue. His stride slowed near row 2 again, but didn't stop. Eric noticed the faint twitch in Marin's jaw. Restrained aggression coiled into poise. Calculated tension. The first move wasn't meant to be loud. Just enough to destabilize. Just enough to shift the story. Eric's fingers curled gently against the seat's armrest. Not in fear, but in focus. He didn't respond to Marin's games. Not yet. Not here. Composure was still his strongest weapon. But across the aisle, Darren Velro turned a page for the first time, and the sound of the paper crinkling felt like a match being struck. And somewhere behind the professional smiles, an unseen plan was already unfolding. The cart slammed against the seat frame with a loud metallic rattle, the rubber wheels skidding slightly on the narrow aisle carpet. Eric flinched, not from fear, but from calculation. His knees had narrowly avoided being struck. Marin Salvak didn't apologize. He adjusted the cart with just enough force to make it seem intentional, but still plausible as carelessness. "Beverages?" Marin asked with a thin veneer of professionalism. Though his tone was tighter, the pitch clipped. His blue eyes flicked across the row. Passengers along the left aisle nodded, requesting coffee, tea, soda. Marin handed each drink with quick, practiced motions. But when he reached Eric's seat, he didn't stop. His hand, which had paused over every other seat, bypassed Eric entirely. No eye contact, no offer, just a silent skip as if Eric didn't exist. Eric noticed. So did the 2 men seated diagonally behind him, both shifting slightly as though sensing the breach of protocol, but choosing not to speak. The silence in that moment was sharper than any insult. Eric said nothing. He kept his expression unreadable, hands resting lightly on the armrests, but his mind cataloged the detail precisely. Marin was escalating. This wasn't passive aggression. It was targeted and public enough for others to observe. He could feel the edge tightening around him. Moments later, as Marin leaned across the aisle to hand a ginger ale to seat 2B, his arm brushed against Eric's shoulder, not a casual accident, but a touch too forceful to dismiss. Eric remained still. He could sense the eyes on him now, passengers watching the exchange, unsure whether to look away or prepare for something worse. Then came the voice. "Careful with that briefcase. People notice things they aren't supposed to." The words were low and deliberate, spoken from a man in seat 3C, Darren Velro. Eric turned his head slightly. Darren's face was neutral, his posture relaxed, still holding the travel magazine he'd been pretending to read since takeoff. His lips barely moved. His tone was quiet enough to be missed by others, but heavy enough to land. Eric studied him for a beat. The words weren't threatening, but neither were they casual. A warning cloaked in ambiguity. Then, without waiting for a response, Darren turned a page of his magazine and leaned back, as though he had said nothing at all. The knot in Eric's stomach tightened, coiling low beneath his sternum. Darren's message wasn't random. It had context, precise, timely context. There were 2 variables now. Marin, with his overt hostility, and Darren, whose behavior felt more surgical. Eric reached down calmly to adjust his briefcase, double-checking the lock. The biometric seal glowed green for a half-second, then dimmed. Still secure, but something didn't feel right. The faintest line, a scratch near the locking port, barely visible, fresh, and he knew he hadn't left it that way. A flicker of unease passed through him, but he buried it beneath his focus. He leaned back in his seat, repositioning his body slightly to shield the briefcase from direct access. The soft cabin lights overhead cast a cool glow, painting shadows across Marin's face as the attendant circled back. Marin stopped near row 2. Just stopped. No task. No pretense. Just stood there, watching. Eric looked up slowly. "Is there an issue?" he asked, voice steady, eyes unwavering. Marin's mouth twisted into something faintly resembling a smile. "No issue," he said, taking a step closer. "Unless you make one." The words hovered in the air, sharp and deliberate. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Another passenger adjusted his headphones but didn't press play. This wasn't a flight anymore. It was a stage, and Eric had been forced into the spotlight. He studied Marin's expression, the twitch of the jaw, the slightly raised shoulder, the way his left hand hovered just at his belt line, as if anticipating resistance. Eric had seen this kind of preparation before. Too much tension for a simple service issue. Marin moved along eventually, but not without brushing his elbow along the headrest of Eric's seat again. The message was sent without a single word. He wanted a reaction, but Eric wouldn't give it. Not yet. Still, something deeper churned beneath the surface. The warning, the exclusion, the scratch. The way Darren's words hadn't asked, but advised. Marin might have been the actor, but someone else was directing. Eric adjusted his collar slowly, ignoring the rising warmth behind his temples. He kept his breath even, his gaze forward, but his mind was already assembling a framework. If Marin was trying to provoke him publicly, there had to be a second motive, one that required distraction. His eyes flicked briefly to the overhead compartments, the security camera domes in the corners, and the emergency exit indicator at the front. He didn't miss anything. So what were they trying to make him miss? Footsteps returned. Marin again. Only this time, no pretense of service, no cart, no tray, no checklist. Just presence. Standing inches from Eric's armrest. People in suits sometimes forget where they stand. Marin muttered, voice low enough to seem private, but loud enough for the man behind Eric to hear. Eric exhaled slowly, folding his hands on his lap, refusing to meet the insult with reaction. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And in the stillness that followed, even the cabin lights seemed to dim further, as if preparing for something to break. The flight leveled off, but inside the aircraft, turbulence of another kind was building. Marin's shoes clicked once against the carpet as he turned and walked away. Eric closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his pulse steady but sharp behind his ribs. The game had escalated, and someone had just placed their opening bet. His thoughts locked onto the briefcase once more, and the countdown began ticking louder in his head. What Eric didn't realize was that the first strike would come without warning. Marin brushed his shoulder against the top of Eric's headrest. Not gently, not by accident. The contact was deliberate, too deliberate for a seasoned flight attendant performing routine aisle rounds. The touch was a silent message, a warning dressed in the quiet uniform of civility. Eric didn't flinch. He straightened in his seat, spine aligning with the backrest as his eyes followed Marin's retreating figure through the cabin. The surrounding passengers stirred subtly, turning pages without reading, glancing sideways without moving their heads. Everyone felt the shift. The cabin air, once neutral, had turned heavier, slower, like it carried an electrical charge. Eric kept his breathing steady, but inside, the wires of his mind pulled tight. He'd seen this before in boardrooms, aggressors who wore calm like a mask while trying to destabilize their target. Conflict wasn't always loud. Sometimes it started with the small things, an invasive gesture, a challenging glance, a prolonged silence. And yet Marin wasn't the only variable anymore. Eric glanced across the aisle. Darren Velro still held his travel magazine, but he hadn't flipped a page in over 10 minutes. His eyes drifted down every so often, not toward the window, not toward the overhead controls, but toward Eric's briefcase beneath seat 2A. That alone wouldn't have concerned him, but it was the way Darren glanced away when caught, too fast, too rehearsed. The man was clearly pretending to read, while his real focus anchored to something far more specific. That briefcase, the encrypted proposal chip inside it. Eric leaned forward under the pretense of adjusting his seat recline. His fingers touched the latches of the briefcase. He paused. A thin scratch ran along the left locking mechanism. It hadn't been there before boarding. The mark was clean, fresh, too shallow for luggage damage, too precise for accident. Someone had tampered with it. He inhaled quietly through his nose, and a pulse of heat passed through his chest. His fingers hovered at the scratch, feeling its edge with clinical precision. That small detail, unnoticed by anyone else, flashed a warning across his thoughts. The threat wasn't building. It had already begun, and they had made a move. He slowly sat back up and let his gaze lift naturally toward the aisle again. Marin was walking back, this time slower, less performative. He wasn't pushing a cart or carrying anything. He simply stopped next to row 2 and turned as if waiting for Eric to speak. For a moment, neither said anything. Passengers nearby feigned distraction, but the theater of it all was obvious now. It was a scene waiting for dialogue. Eric broke the silence, voice low and deliberate. "Is there an issue?" he asked, not because he didn't know, but because it forced Marin to either step forward or back. Marin tilted his head slightly, a half-smile curving across his mouth. "No issue," he said, voice like cool static. Then he leaned in just enough for only Eric in the nearby row to hear. "Unless you make one." The line wasn't loud, but sliced the air all the same. A man 3 rows back shifted visibly in his seat. Another leaned slightly away from the aisle. One passenger across from Eric, a balding man in business casual, glanced between them and muttered under his breath, "Not normal." The atmosphere wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was on edge. Eric held Marin's gaze without blinking. He recognized the maneuver. Create friction. Corner the target. If Eric raised his voice, if he pushed back, Marin could paint him as unruly, as combative. That might be enough for a report. Enough for removal. Or worse, enough to seize the briefcase as evidence. But Eric didn't bite. He leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable. The faintest tightening of his jaw was the only hint of how closely wounded he'd become. Every breath he took was measured, every blink intentional. Marin lingered a second longer, waiting. When Eric said nothing, the attendant finally moved on, but not far. He stopped a few seats behind, speaking softly to a colleague, but kept his eyes periodically flicking forward. Across the aisle, Darren Velro shifted again. This time he stretched, reaching under his seat. Eric tracked the movement with his peripheral vision. Darren's hand didn't retrieve anything. It hovered as if checking space, dimensions, timing. Something about the coordination was too clean. Marin agitating the target. Darren watching the case. Small pressure points applied like clockwork. Eric slid a hand to the seatbelt clasp, not to remove it, but to feel its shape, its readiness. His eyes scanned the seat back in front of him, reflecting his own expression faintly in the dark screen. He looked composed, but his mind was a field of shifting equations. What was the endgame? Was the goal to remove him from the flight, or to separate him from the briefcase? When Marin passed again, he slowed, then stopped as if summoned by some silent cue. This time his smile was gone. "There's been a lot of shifting in this row," Marin said aloud, this time loud enough for passengers to hear. "Just making sure we're all settled." It was bait. Before Eric could respond, the man in 2C raised an eyebrow. "Is something wrong?" Marin didn't reply to the passenger. His eyes locked with Eric's. There was no need to escalate yet, but everything in his posture radiated a quiet threat. Eric tilted his head. "We're settled, unless you have a different assessment." Marin's smile returned, thinner now. "Not at all." He turned and walked off, but his pace quickened, his tension breaking momentarily under the surface. Eric sat still, hands on his knees, mind mapping the sequence of actions that had just taken place. Something was wrong on this flight, but it wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Every move so far had been coordinated to get one result: disruption. And that disruption had just failed. He looked down again at the briefcase and memorized the scratch. He would use that later. But for now, the air remained thick like a room before a storm. Tension hummed beneath the hum of the engines. Even the cabin lights seemed dimmer, like they, too, were waiting for the next move. And when the moment finally snapped, it shattered far louder than anyone expected. The pressure inside the cabin reached a sharp point when Marin stopped abruptly beside Eric's seat, his shadow casting across the tray table like a curtain closing on civility. He leaned in slowly, posture rigid, eyes hard. The expression on his face wasn't neutral. It bristled with something darker, something that hovered between provocation and threat. Conversations around them halted mid-sentence. A child's cartoon paused on a nearby screen, forgotten. Breaths hitched in throats, as though the cabin itself anticipated something about to break. Marin's voice cut the silence like a cold wire. "So what exactly makes you think you deserve this seat?" His words weren't shouted, but the tone was deliberate, low, sharp, and meant for the entire row to hear. It wasn't a question about boarding class or ticket status. It was a challenge directed at Eric's right to belong in that space, in that moment. A challenge to his authority, to his presence. Eric turned toward him, slow and calm. His expression remained composed, but his eyes had sharpened like steel beneath frost. "My boarding pass confirms it," he replied evenly, holding Marin's gaze without flinch or heat. His tone carried the weight of restraint, the kind trained through years of boardroom tension and hostile negotiations. Marin's jaw tightened. He stepped forward slightly, enough for the subtle invasion of personal space to feel intentional. Several passengers in the surrounding seats stiffened instinctively, shoulders drawing back as though trying to shrink from the looming conflict. But Eric didn't move. His stillness was a silent stand. He had seen this tactic before: apply pressure, provoke a slip, then weaponize the reaction. But he also saw something else. Across the aisle, Darren Velro was no longer pretending to read his magazine. His gaze, quiet and calculating, was fixed on the briefcase under Eric's seat. Not the confrontation, not the rising voices, just the briefcase. He wasn't a concerned bystander. He was measuring, timing, like a man waiting for a gate to open. The plane gave a subtle shudder as it hit a pocket of turbulence. The overhead lights flickered once, then stabilized. Marin used the moment to lean in even closer, his breath sharp against Eric's cheek. "Men like you think the world bends for them," he hissed, loud enough to ensure surrounding passengers heard. Eric blinked once, slowly. His voice came like a clean cut through smoke. "Is there something you need to say directly?" For a moment, Marin's face twitched, an involuntary reaction, frustration leaking past the mask. He had expected defiance, emotion, anything to justify escalation. But Eric gave him nothing. That failure, the refusal to give him control, seemed to stir something reckless in Marin. A pulse of instability danced behind his eyes. His breath shortened. His knuckles flexed at his sides, the tendons stiffening like ropes drawn tight. Passengers held their breath. A man, too, rose behind, leaned forward, as if trying to intervene without crossing a line. A teenager across the aisle pulled out his phone, screen dimmed, but camera clearly recording. Everyone knew. They didn't understand the full context, but they understood the tension had turned. It wasn't professional anymore. It was personal, and it was about to collapse. In the split second that followed, Eric noticed Darren subtly adjusting in his seat again. Not shifting for comfort, positioning. Preparing. His hand edged slightly toward the aisle, just shy of being noticeable. But Eric saw it. It was a rehearsal. Whatever was coming wasn't spontaneous. It had been set in motion long before the plane left the tarmac. Eric narrowed his eyes, his senses tightening around him like a suit of armor. This wasn't just about ego or prejudice. It was coordinated. Darren's timing, Marin's pressure. The energy in the cabin now felt like a storm building beneath a false sky. And then the final moment arrived. Marin's voice returned, barely more than a breath. Men like you think the world bends for them. There was again, the same line. But this time, something cracked behind it, an edge of fury that had lost its mask. He didn't wait for a reply. He wasn't seeking one. Eric held his position, his tone unchanged. Is there something you need to say directly? Marin's expression twitched again, worse this time. He hadn't gotten what he wanted, and the failure to provoke a public meltdown only intensified his loss of control. He wasn't just angry. He was cornered by his own strategy. The passengers could feel it. Tension coiled into stillness. And like the split second before lightning breaks a sky, they knew what was coming. That failure seemed to ignite something reckless in him. Passengers braced. A line had been crossed, and everyone could feel the cabin's collective inhale waiting for the snap. And that snap came faster than thought, breaking the silence like glass. Without the slightest warning, Marin's fist shot forward and struck Eric square in the mouth. The impact was brutal, sharp knuckles driving into flesh and bone with such force that the sound echoed like a metal tray dropped on tile. Eric's head snapped sideways, and a thin arc of blood traced across his lower lip, flicking onto the leather armrest. Gasps erupted from the nearby rows, sharp and instinctive, as if the entire cabin had just been yanked into a different reality. The violence hadn't just broken the calm. It had ruptured the thin veneer of control that had barely held the cabin together. Eric didn't fall. His body leaned slightly with the hit, but he remained seated, back firm against the headrest, eyes still open. For a second, his hands gripped the armrest like landing gear bracing for turbulence. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, warm and metallic. But what Marin expected, fear, rage, confusion, never arrived. Instead, Eric slowly turned his head back toward the man who had just assaulted him, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Marin stood above him, fists still tight, breathing heavily through flared nostrils. His face was red, not just from the exertion, but from something deeper, something reckless and personal. This wasn't the explosion of a man who had lost control. This was premeditated, intentional. The way his feet had been placed, the way his stance braced for retaliation, the way his voice barked out, "Stay down." Even though Eric hadn't moved, every element pointed to a single truth. Marin had been waiting for this moment. But it didn't go the way he thought it would. Passengers nearby froze. Several hands shot to their seatbelts, some trembling toward phones. The cabin's lights, soft blue from earlier, now felt too dim, too intimate, like the setting for something wrong. In row 3, an elderly man dropped his newspaper. In row 5, a younger businessman lifted his phone with hands so shaky the camera frame wobbled uncontrollably. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "Is this real?" It was real. Darren Velro, still seated across the aisle, didn't flinch at the violence. His reaction was more methodical. Eyes flicked, first to Eric, then to the briefcase under his seat, then to Marin. No emotion, no alarm. Just a sequence, a calculation, like he was tracking variables, not people. Like this was a chessboard, and someone had just tried to sacrifice a piece. Eric's hand moved slowly. He wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his knuckle, then inspected the blood briefly before resting his hand in plain sight. His breathing was deep, but even. The way he sat was disarming, not defensive, not aggressive, but perfectly balanced. That stillness became louder than Marin's punch. It was the kind of restraint that unsettled predators, the kind that warned of far greater power held in reserve. Marin's jaw tightened. He had been counting on a reaction, a shove, a shout, anything to turn this into a justifiable removal. But Eric offered none of it, just quiet, piercing presence. A male passenger 2 rows behind stood halfway from his seat. "What the? Did you just hit him?" he called out. Marin's eyes flicked to him, then back to Eric. The hum of the aircraft seemed to dull. All sound narrowed to the weight of breathing, the whir of circulating air, and the low vibrations of tension threading through every fiber of the cabin. Marin's voice cracked with urgency. "You heard me. Stay down." But Eric wasn't moving. He tilted his head ever so slightly, his lip bleeding, eyes locked on Marin with a coldness that made the larger man falter. Not from fear, but from a realization that something had shifted. The blow hadn't pushed Eric into panic. It had exposed something. A threshold had been crossed, and the person seated before him had not risen to meet it with emotion, but with calculation. An unspoken understanding passed between them. This wasn't over. Marin's fists lowered slightly, but his shoulders remained squared. Around them, the passengers murmured, some in confusion, others in quiet support. A teenage boy whispered to his father. That guy in the suit didn't even flinch. Another man said to no one in particular, "Isn't that illegal? That's assault." Even the flight attendants further down the cabin paused. One man near the galley looked toward the disturbance, his steps uncertain, his instincts warring with protocol. Cameras were up. Everything was being recorded. And still, Eric hadn't moved from his seat. He let the silence hold. He let Marin stew in it. Let every eye in the cabin bear down on the man who had thrown the punch. And then, quietly, with a voice smooth and low, Eric said, "You've already lost." The line wasn't loud, but it carried a scalpel, not a hammer. It drew a sharp breath from a passenger in 4C. It caused Marin's nostrils to flare. But it was Darren's face that truly shifted. Something in the balance had changed. This wasn't supposed to be the result. This was supposed to be over by now. Marin's plan, if it had been his alone, had failed. But Eric suspected Marin was not acting alone. The blow had been the signal, not the outcome. Someone else had been waiting for the chaos to erupt, waiting to use it. And Eric now knew. The attack had never been about hurting him. It was about displacing him, creating a commotion strong enough to draw him away from the one thing that couldn't be allowed to land intact, the briefcase. Eric lowered his gaze slightly, enough to glimpse it still safely under his legs. Locked, unmoved, but exposed. A quiet alarm rang in his instincts. He sat back, shoulders square, spine straight, eyes never leaving Marin. If there was a plan, it had failed its first step, but the second would come soon. He needed to be ready, and he would be. The entire cabin held its breath for the next flashpoint. Eric slowly wiped the corner of his mouth, the composure in his movements chilling and precise. In that quiet second, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Marin had initiated a battle he could not control. The attack was no accident. It was part of a larger plan meant to derail something important. The passengers braced, and the tension thickened into something solid. But what happened next stunned even the aggressor. Eric rose from his seat, not in haste, not in fury, but with a measured, unsettling precision. The movement was so calculated that the passengers in adjacent rows instinctively leaned back, bracing as if an explosion had been triggered. His lip was split, the dull ache of the strike still blooming across his jaw, but his eyes held none of the tremble that Marin expected. Instead, they carried a steadiness that unsettled more than any raised voice could have. Blood dripped slowly from the corner of Eric's mouth, trailing down the edge of his chin, but he didn't wipe it. He let it mark him. Marin Salvak instinctively stepped backward. The anticipation of dominance, of control, had slipped through his fingers. He had expected Eric to cower, to argue, to react emotionally. But now, faced with a man who said nothing, who didn't tremble, who simply stood, he found himself momentarily disarmed. The aisle, narrow and boxed by shoulders and camera phones, became a ring. No one moved. No one spoke above a whisper. Some passengers simply clutched their armrests. Others held their phones aloft, their screens trembling from the tension in their hands. Eric stood still, shoulders squared, gaze fixed. He didn't glance at the cameras, nor at the spreading smear of blood on the back of his hand. His attention was reserved only for Marin, who, after a breath, circled slightly to Eric's side like a predator regaining confidence. "You want to escalate this?" Marin spat, his voice frayed. "You think standing makes you stronger?" Eric didn't respond. That silence provoked another surge of anger. Marin lunged again, his arms slashing in a wide, uncontrolled arc. But this time, Eric moved. Swiftly. Precisely. His right hand shot up and caught Marin's wrist mid-air, clean, sharp, and absolute. The slap of skin on skin echoed down the aisle louder than the engines. Gasps burst like sparks from the watching rows. Eric's grip locked, not just with force, but with command. Marin tried instinctively to yank free, his face twitching with a mix of panic and surprise. But his wrist was held fast, as though caught in steel. Eric's body remained steady, his feet anchored with intent. He didn't wrench. He didn't shout. He simply held the man. The tension in the cabin shifted from anticipation to awe. In one untelegraphed movement, Eric twisted his body sideways, stepping subtly into the narrow gap between the seats. Using Marin's own momentum, Eric pivoted and drove the flight attendant's face downward, directly into the curved metal of Seat 2 BS armrest. The impact rang out, crisp and brutal. A crack echoed, unmistakably the sound of bone giving way. Marin's cry was muffled, swallowed by the armrest, then followed by the sick splatter of blood that painted the brushed aluminum and dripped onto the blue carpet below. The entire aircraft surged with noise. Passengers screamed. Some dropped their phones. Others turned away or crouched into the aisles, shielding children, gasping as though the pressurized cabin had ruptured. Marin crumpled. His body collapsed into the aisle with the weight of someone whose center had just been fractured. He clutched his face, his hands trying uselessly to contain the flow of blood gushing from his ruined nose. He rocked slightly, stunned and disoriented, trying to make sense of the pain while the room spun around him. Eric stepped back, not in retreat, but in measured retreatment, like a chess master pulling his piece from the board after capturing a king's knight. He adjusted his footing, chest rising and falling not with rage, but with regulated breath. Calm, controlled, focused. His gaze never left Marin. Passengers now flooded the cabin with a new kind of energy. The phones were raised again, capturing the aftermath. Some shouted for the captain, others cried for help. A few simply sat stunned, mouths open, minds unable to process what they had just seen. Yet amidst all of it, Eric stood centered, unmoved, as though the chaos orbited him, not the other way around. Darren Velro, still seated across the aisle, did not react like the rest. He didn't film. He didn't cry out. He didn't stand. He flinched, not from fear, but from realization. Something in Darren's expression shifted, a subtle collapse of confidence, as if one crucial variable had just failed in a complex plan. His eyes darted from Marin's broken frame to the briefcase beside Eric's seat, then to Eric himself. A thought bloomed behind those measured eyes, one that looked like recalibration. He had just watched the moment his plan lost its most important leverage. Marin groaned again, struggling to his knees, swaying as if the floor no longer held him steady. Blood poured freely, soaking into his collar and dripping onto his shoes. Yet his eyes weren't entirely glazed. He looked up through the red haze, hate flickering in their depths, but also something new, defeat. Eric remained silent. He didn't look for praise, didn't scan the room to see who had recorded what. He stood in front of his briefcase like a sentinel, hands visible, shoulders relaxed, body language neutral, but undeniably powerful. No one moved to stop him. No one dared speak against him. And in that dense, breathless stillness, the hierarchy of the cabin rewrote itself. And for the first time, everyone understood that Eric had never been the victim. They had misread the entire balance of power. He acted confident, sure his attack would go unchallenged, unaware that every second had been anticipated, every movement calculated, and every passenger silently witnessing the reversal. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when courage and strategy collide, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Marin screamed for security, his voice ragged and cracking, distorted by pain and the blood spilling freely from his shattered nose. The thick crimson drops fell onto the carpeted aisle, dotting it like war stains. But Eric Landor didn't move an inch. He stood still in the narrow aisle, tall and steady, hands raised in plain sight, not in surrender, but in deliberate visibility. He wasn't a threat. He was the line that had refused to break. The intercom flared with static before the captain's voice broke through, laced with unease. Everyone remained seated. Flight officers are coming forward. Eric's eyes narrowed. That voice was too quick, too rehearsed. He had traveled enough flights to know how long protocol usually took. But this response? It was already waiting, as if someone had predicted this exact trigger. His attention shifted instantly down the aisle. Two uniformed male flight officers appeared at the far end. They weren't rushing, nor were they cautious. Instead, they walked with an eerie confidence, urgency without panic. Their postures were rigid, their gazes fixed directly on Eric. Not on the injured man, bleeding into the carpet. Not on the passengers yelling. Just on him. And that's when Eric knew. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. Passengers whispered across rows, heads swiveling from Eric to Marin to the approaching officers. There was no confusion in the air, just tightly coiled tension, like everyone had unknowingly stepped into a scene already written. Then, like a curtain rising on Act 2, Darren Velro stood up. Until now, he had been the quiet man with the travel magazine. Harmless, civil, unremarkable. But when he rose, he did not fumble or hesitate. He moved with slow, silent certainty. And something shifted in his face, his calm, neutral mask folding into something colder, more precise. Gone was the passenger. In his place stood a man with purpose. Eric's mind locked onto the pieces. The aggressive attendant. The conveniently fast captain response. The unnatural posture of the incoming officers. And now Darren's transformation. This was not about the assault. This was about the briefcase. Eric shifted subtly, angling his body just enough to stand in front of his seat, seat 2A. His foot nudged the case closer beneath him. If this was a ploy to separate him from it, they have to go through him first. The two officers raised their voices as they neared. "Sir, step away now," one barked, not even pretending civility. But Eric didn't flinch. His reply was clear, calm, and razor-edged. "State your reason." They didn't answer. Their silence hung like a blade midair. The passengers reacted before the officers could move again. "He was attacked first," one man yelled from row 3. "We have it on video," another woman shouted, lifting her phone. The officers paused, eyes flicking around the cabin. Dozens of cameras, dozens of recordings. The illusion of control began to tremble. And that's when Darren moved into the aisle. Not fast, not reckless, but with a slowness that made Eric's spine go cold. He wasn't trying to de-escalate. He was reclaiming the moment. "You should have stayed down," Darren muttered. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cabin like a scalpel. A warning. A promise. Eric's pulse remained steady, but inside, every calculation clicked into place. Darren wasn't reacting. He was resuming. Marin hadn't acted alone. The fight hadn't been personal. It had been diversion. Conflict to create confusion. Confusion to justify intervention. Intervention to extract the briefcase. And Eric had disrupted every beat of their plan. But now the tempo was accelerating. The officers stepped again, visibly rattled by the crowd. They seemed less certain of their roles now. Eric could see it, the flicker of doubt, the silent question. Who's really in charge here? Darren's presence didn't help. He wasn't crew, and now that he had stepped forward, several nearby passengers turned toward him, whispering. He wasn't wearing uniform earlier, someone noted. Who is he? Eric's focus sharpened to a needlepoint. He didn't know how far this plan reached or how many players were still hidden. But one truth had clarified beyond doubt. They had underestimated him. He bent slightly at the knees, subtle, invisible to most, but it was preparation. Not to flee, to protect. Darren's gaze flicked to the briefcase again. The officers shifted, hesitating. And Eric realized in that moment, this entire second wave of pressure, the false authority, the command to step away, was all to isolate the briefcase. Marin's assault wasn't a mistake. It was bait. Now, the attempt to strip him of his presence, his credibility, his proximity to the encrypted chip, that was the goal. But it was too late. The cameras had seen. The passengers had awakened. And Darren's mask had slipped. As if sensing the collapse, Darren's eyes narrowed. There was a final move coming. Eric could feel it. The cabin was silent again, except for the hum of engines and Marin's labored, bloody breathing. Then Darren spoke again, so low it was almost missed. This didn't have to be loud. Eric's answer was quieter. Then you shouldn't have made it public. The two men stared at each other in a standoff of wills, both knowing the next action would determine everything. And the next move revealed just how deep the setup truly went. Darren Velro's voice cut through the noise with deliberate precision. Captain requested the item under your seat for security review. The line wasn't shouted. It was smooth, rehearsed, the kind of sentence that could pass as legitimate if the listener was flustered, scared, or uninformed. But Eric Landor was none of those things. The words triggered a cold spark in his mind. There was the real play. They didn't want him removed. They wanted what he carried. Eric didn't blink. "You don't work for this airline," he replied, voice clear and cold. The effect was immediate and electric. A collective gasp fluttered across nearby rows. Several passengers turned in unison, eyes darting between Darren and the two flight officers, whose confident posture now faltered. One of them, the taller officer with a silver stripe on his sleeve, took a half-step back, confused. Darren froze. It was the smallest pause, half a second, but it shattered the illusion. He hadn't expected to be called out, and certainly not with such clarity. The flight officers looked at each other, visibly unsure. One of them murmured, "You're not on crew manifest, are you?" But it wasn't a real question. It was an admission. Eric saw it all in their body language. Hesitation, doubt, the creeping realization that they had been manipulated. Darren's eyes narrowed. Hand over the briefcase. "It's for everyone's safety." His tone shifted, now harsher, less polished. "No," Eric said firmly, his voice slicing through the thickening air like a blade. He angled his body slightly, shielding the briefcase with his shin. "You're not getting it." The moment spiraled. The cabin, once filled with whispers, was now a silent pressure cooker. Phones filmed everything. Marin, still crouched on the carpet near row 2 with blood leaking through his fingers, lifted his head weakly and rasped. "Get it, take it." That line sealed the truth. A few rows back, a man in a navy blazer stood and pointed. He just confirmed it. They're after the case. Chaos teetered at the edge of control. The taller flight officer raised his hands, signaling the other to step back. "Everyone remain seated," he shouted, his voice trying to reclaim order, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He no longer trusted the ground he stood on. Darren's hand moved. Slow at first, it slid into his inner jacket pocket, measured, theatrical, but unmistakably charged. A dangerous kind of slowness, the kind that said, "I want you to see what I'm about to do, but not understand it fast enough to stop me." Passengers screamed. "Don't pull anything," someone yelled from row 6. Eric didn't yell. He crouched slightly, dropping his center of gravity, legs braced. His right hand hovered just beside his hip, not for a weapon, but for balance, for timing. Every muscle in his frame tightened, ready to act. Darren's fingers emerged, holding not a weapon, but a badge. He thrust it forward. "Skyvale Operations," he declared. For a heartbeat, almost worked. The badge glinted under the cabin lights, official-looking, neatly laminated. But it was the wrong color. Skyvale staff badges, Eric knew, were deep indigo with silver accents. This one, flat gray with a faint copper trim, off by just enough to break the spell. "That's fake," a young man shouted from the back. 3 more voices joined in. "Not real. That's not the color they use. He's a plant." The illusion shattered. The officers backed away fully now, hands up, the fear in their eyes overtaking any lingering doubt. They had been duped, and the plane had nearly become the scene of a silent theft in plain sight. Darren's jaw flexed. The badge vanished back into his jacket as quickly as it had come out. Then he lunged. It was messy, desperate, more instinct than plan. He aimed straight for Eric's lap, hand reaching for the briefcase like a drowning man grabbing a rope. Eric reacted without hesitation. He spun with a lunge, intercepting Darren's wrist mid-air, redirecting his momentum. Using the tight space between rows as leverage, Eric pivoted on one heel and threw Darren sideways, directly into the aisle seat of row 2B. Darren's shoulder slammed against the metal armrest with a solid thud, the same armrest that had been slick with Marin's blood minutes earlier. His breath shot out of him, a grunt torn from deep in his chest as he crumpled to the floor. Gasps turned into cheers. It wasn't celebration, it was release. The tension, the confusion, the fear of watching something wrong unfold in real time without being able to stop it, now finally cracked. Applause erupted, jagged and uneven, but human. The taller flight officer looked dazed. He leaned toward Eric. What is in that case? Eric didn't answer. He simply pulled it into his lap and kept his eyes on Darren, who now lay still, stunned, clutching his ribs and blinking up at the ceiling. The aircraft, though still airborne, finally felt grounded in truth. The real threat had never been chaos. It had been precision. A quiet, calculated operation designed to remove a single item from a single passenger. And it had failed. Eric's lips still throbbed from Marin's punch. The blood had dried at the corner of his mouth. But his mind was sharp, locked in. The attack had revealed more than just hostility. It had revealed structure, strategy, orders. They weren't random men acting out. They had been sent. He scanned the cabin. Cameras were still rolling. Witnesses still alert. The playing field had shifted. Eric leaned back slightly and closed his hand around the briefcase handle. And the next moment tore the truth open in full view of the entire aircraft. Darren's hand moved toward his jacket, slow enough to show intent, but fast enough to trigger fear. Several passengers cried out almost in unison, raw instinct taking over where words failed. Hands reached for seatbacks. A man in 4C stood halfway, unsure whether to intervene or duck. The narrow cabin transformed in an instant from tense to volatile. Eric's body shifted, angling protectively between Darren and the briefcase. Every movement now was measured not in seconds, but in heartbeats. The two flight officers paused mid-step, their hesitation loud in a room full of unspoken calculations. They had advanced with the kind of certainty expected of authority, but now that confidence faltered. Their eyes darted between Darren and Eric, trying to read the threat, but finding no clear script to follow. They weren't trained for this. The hierarchy had collapsed under the weight of ambiguity. From the floor, Marin groaned, blood matting his shirt collar, one hand twitching against the aisle carpet. "Get it? Take it," he muttered through cracked lips, the urgency in his voice confirming what Eric had already suspected. This wasn't about rage or confusion. It was about theft. Precise. Orchestrated. Then Darren produced it, not a weapon, but something designed to control perception. A Skyvale operations badge. He held it up like a shield, eyes scanning the cabin with thinly veiled desperation. The badge gleamed under the overhead lights, but its edges were wrong. The color strip was off. The material too matte. For passengers familiar with Skyvale's real credentials, the difference was obvious. "That's fake," someone shouted from the rear. The words detonated the illusion. A chorus of voices erupted, anger, fear, disbelief. Phones tilted higher. Kameraflashes blinked. The officers recoiled. One even stepped back, realizing too late he had been following the wrong lead. Darren's smirk faded, replaced with a tightening jaw and dilated eyes. His bluff had failed. In a final desperate lunge, Darren launched himself forward, aiming not for Eric, but the briefcase under his arm. It was a sudden, jerking movement, wild in its urgency, reckless in its aim. But Eric had been waiting. He pivoted on his left foot, sidestepping just enough to let Darren's own momentum work against him. Gripping the man's wrist, Eric redirected the force and drove him sideways, hard, into the armrest of seat 2B. The impact was brutal. Darren's shoulder hit first, then his ribs. His breath expelled in a strangled grunt. His body crumpled into the aisle, colliding with the same armrest Marin had bled over just minutes before. The visual symmetry was undeniable. Poetic, violent. Gasps and scattered applause broke out across the rows. Some passengers clapped instinctively, others out of sheer relief. Eric didn't move. He stood tall, one hand still half raised, the other gripping the briefcase against his side. His lip throbbed where Marin had struck him earlier, but his eyes were unwavering. Every sense was on high alert. The officers, no longer playing by anyone's orders, finally stepped away from the chaos, hands open, brows furrowed. Their silence was their admission. They had been pawns. The cabin finally began to stabilize, not in comfort, but in clarity. The fog had lifted. This wasn't a misunderstanding, nor a fluke. It was a coordinated operation aimed at intercepting something valuable mid-flight. And the man at the center of it, the one they had tried to unseat, had just dismantled the plan with restraint, strategy, and force only when necessary. Darren groaned from the floor, stunned, half-conscious. Marin was curled against the wall, rage flickering behind swollen eyes. Passengers watched Eric like a man who had just walked out of fire. Some recorded still. Some sat in stunned silence. And amid it all, Eric exhaled slowly, grounding himself. He knew this wasn't over. There was still time before landing. Still a descent to survive. But for now, the threat had been exposed and the false players revealed. The chip was safe. For now. And as the cabin settled, everyone realized Eric had just dismantled a conspiracy at 30,000 feet. The captain's voice sliced through the cabin noise with brittle clarity. "Dr. Lindor, stay where you are. Officers, step back. We are diverting to Harlan Aerodrome due to a security breach." The declaration was both a lifeline and a warning. It electrified the passengers. Applause broke out, not of celebration, but of exhausted relief. Safety, at last, felt within reach. The flight officers, frozen mid-step just feet from Eric, obeyed with visible hesitation. They exchanged glances, then retreated slowly, as if unsure whether they were stepping away from a passenger or a fuse. Marin, slumped against the wall near the galley, didn't speak at first. His breathing was shallow, wet with blood. His shirt was soaked crimson, and yet his eyes still burned. Eric watched him in silence, not with hatred, but with calculation. The flight attendant wasn't finished. He was defeated but not done. Darren Velro, sprawled a short distance away with his coat wrinkled and dignity shattered, didn't attempt to rise. His forged badge lay beside him, a prop that had failed its audience. His hand twitched once, as though still longing to reach for the briefcase that Eric now placed squarely in his lap, hands firmly over it, body coiled like steel around it. One row behind, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer leaned forward. "Sir, I filmed the whole thing," he whispered. "You handled yourself with class." Others chimed in softly. "You were calm the entire time. We saw it all. I sent the footage to the network already." Eric offered a nod of acknowledgement, his face unreadable. He appreciated their support, but he trusted only what he could see and guard himself. While the cabin buzzed with post-crisis murmurs, Eric's mind pushed deeper into the shadowed architecture of the situation. 2 anonymous warnings had reached him earlier in the week. Do not fly Skyvale. Do not sit in 2A. He had dismissed them. Now, the chain of events unfolding in real time demanded he reevaluate every assumption. These men, Marin and Darren, were not amateurs. Their coordination suggested rehearsal. Darren's earlier whisper, the forced conflict, the push toward a forced removal, all of it had been executed with surgical intent. They hadn't come to humiliate him. They had come to separate him from the chip. So the real question lingered like smoke. Who had sent them? He glanced toward the cockpit, wondering who else might have been part of it. A rogue captain? Someone feeding information from the crew manifest? No. The captain's voice earlier had cracked with genuine alarm. That wasn't part of any act. Still, Eric's instincts refused to relax. The threat hadn't ended. The moment they touched ground, other hands might try where these 2 had failed. Marin stirred. His hand brushed against the edge of the galley wall for balance. Blood smeared across the panel. His eyes met Eric's, and for a moment, they locked, not with fear, but with fury restrained by failure. There was no apology, only the glint of a man who had gambled and lost and wanted a rematch. Eric kept his stare steady, but shifted his legs, subtly positioning them for leverage. The briefcase remained pressed to his lap, protected by his forearms. His eyes tracked every breath Marin took, every twitch of Darren's hands. Twice he saw the same motion, an inhale that almost turned into a surge, but not quite. Not here. Not now. Not with every passenger awake and watching. From his ceiling vents, the shift in cabin pressure signaled descent. The aircraft began its slow drop toward the surface, gravity returning with quiet finality. The distant thrum of landing gear echoed below the floor panels. The windows caught the glint of runway lights far below, still flickering through clouds. Eric's mind ran scenario after scenario. What if the police meeting them weren't real? What if the real threat was on the tarmac? He tilted slightly, glancing out the window. Several vehicles moved along the perimeter of the lit tarmac, too many to be a coincidence. He watched flashing beacons, the unmistakable pattern of a coordinated response. But coordination could be copied. He thought of the chip again, the one inside the titanium cradle. It was no ordinary data. It was evidence. The audit logs inside proved that a global aviation firm had quietly tampered with behavioral monitoring algorithms. Passenger tracking systems reprogrammed to prioritize profits, not safety. Manipulated triggers. Suppressed reports. The data could crush careers, collapse stocks, trigger investigations. So someone had tried to intercept it midair. Eric's jaw tightened. Dr. Lendor, a voice came from across the aisle. It was one of the younger passengers, maybe early 20s, sweat on his brow. I don't know who you are, but you just saved this plane. Eric didn't answer. His eyes had caught something else, Darren's fingers curling toward his belt. He tensed ready, but the belt wasn't a weapon. It was just Darren shifting, giving up. The man exhaled and sagged back into the seat, the last of his resolve leaking out of him. A moment later, the tires hit the runway. The jolt shook the cabin. Not gentle, not smooth. A declaration. The plane roared down the concrete like it had something to prove. Passengers braced against the sudden deceleration. Bags rattled overhead. The lights inside flickered as the brakes bit hard. And then, silence. The aircraft slowed to a crawl. Outside, flashing red and blue lights converged. Dozens of them. Squad cars. Security vans. Emergency crews. They waited at the taxiway's edge like a curtain call. Inside the aircraft, no one moved. Even Marin remained still now, defeated. Even Darren seemed smaller, slouched in the seat like he hoped invisibility was an option. Eric's eyes, though swollen from the earlier strike, never drifted far from the front exit. Whatever waited on the ground might be the next phase, or the same danger in a new disguise. But one thing was certain, he was ready. And as the aircraft dropped toward the ground, Eric knew the battle inside the plane was over, but the war outside had just begun. The landing gear hit the runway with a violent thump, jolting the entire cabin as if the aircraft itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. The tires screeched, the fuselage shuddered, and several passengers grabbed their armrests as the plane barreled down the illuminated strip of pavement. Before the engines had even finished their deceleration roar, blue and white lights flashed through the windows, police vehicles and security vans racing into formation around Flight 772 like a net closing around threat. The aircraft rolled to a hard stop. A second later, the front cabin door swung open, and cold night air swept inside along with the heavy footsteps of 6 uniformed officers. They were all men, all sharply alert, and their presence changed the atmosphere instantly. Passengers instinctively straightened, some raising their phones, some pointing shaky fingers toward the men responsible for the in-flight chaos. There, him, and him, a passenger near row 3 called out, gesturing with trembling urgency. Marin Salvak tried to stand, bracing a bloody hand against the wall panel, but his knees buckled before he could rise. A guttural groan broke from him, pain reverberating through his entire posture. His once assertive demeanor was stripped away, leaving only raw anger and the uncomfortable realization that the power he had wielded mid-air had evaporated the moment the plane touched the ground. Darren Velro raised both hands in a weak attempt to look compliant. "I can explain," he began, his voice thin, almost panicked. But the officer nearest him snatched the forged badge straight from his jacket. "This is fake," the officer said with a hard stare, turning the badge over in his gloved hand. Darren's mouth opened and closed, his excuses dying in his throat as the truth became undeniable. Passengers whispered loudly, relief mixing with outrage as two officers pulled Marin upright and cuffed him. Blood dripped down Marin's chin, staining his uniform and the carpet below. He leaned forward and muttered through clenched teeth, "You don't know what you've stopped." His eyes locked on Eric, not with fear, but with a warning. Eric remained silent, though the words dug into him like a cold blade. He understood threats wrapped in riddles. He had heard enough of them in boardrooms, audits, and quiet hostile takeovers to recognize when someone was speaking from a larger agenda. But he also understood that Marin was no mastermind. Someone else had written the script Marin blindly followed. Officer Jalen Verk, a tall man with a steady but powerful presence, approached Eric with purpose. His voice was low but urgent. "Sir, we need you escorted immediately. This wasn't a standard attack. Someone funded this." Eric nodded without hesitation, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation solidified. The officers moved around him in a small protective formation, creating a human shield as they guided him toward the exit. Their boots struck the metal floor in a synchronized rhythm, echoing through the stunned silence of the cabin. As Eric stepped onto the boarding bridge, cold air embraced him, carrying the harsh brightness of emergency lights and the faint smell of jet fuel. The night outside was a maze of security vehicles, camera flashes, and fast-moving silhouettes. Ground crew members recorded the interior damage, while officers took rapid statements from passengers, each recounting the chaos that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. "Keep your head low," one officer instructed as they crossed the tarmac. The man spoke firmly, his eyes scanning every shadow. "Until we know who orchestrated this, you are a high-value target." Eric clutched the briefcase tighter. "That's exactly why they wanted it," he said quietly. Officer Verk opened the door of a dark transport vehicle and motioned Eric inside. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cold air. As Verk settled into the seat beside him, the city lights reflected sharply in the windows. "What exactly is inside that briefcase?" Verk asked, his voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of impending responsibility. Eric paused, not out of hesitation, but because the truth was too big to say without precision. Then he answered, each word deliberate, enough to make someone risk everything to stop it. Verk inhaled slowly, understanding passing over his features like a shadow. The engine rumbled to life, and the vehicle pulled away from the aircraft, weaving through the secured corridor of flashing lights and uniformed officers. Outside, the airport continued buzzing with activity. Officers scanning the perimeter, cameras documenting every angle of the aircraft, passengers giving testimonies with hands that still shook from adrenaline. But inside the transport vehicle, a different kind of tension thickened the air, the awareness that what had happened on Flight 772 was merely the visible tip of something deeper, something orchestrated with purpose. As they approached the terminal security wing, headlights cutting through the night, Eric felt the weight of the night settle fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't the end point of a crisis. It was the start of a larger unraveling, the kind that didn't stay confined to a single flight or a single bad actor. And for the first time, Eric realized this incident was not an end, but a doorway into something far larger. The door locked behind Eric Landor with a cold mechanical hiss, cutting him off from the chaos of the terminal. The room was narrow, sealed on all sides with reinforced steel panels, and lit by a single fluorescent strip buzzing faintly overhead. Two officers flanked the interior corners in silent vigil, their hands resting close to their belts but not on their weapons. Eric sat on a padded bench along the back wall, still gripping the briefcase. His lip was cracked and swollen from the earlier assault, but he paid no mind to the physical pain. His mind churned. A young male medic entered, offering antiseptic wipes and gauze. Eric accepted the materials wordlessly, cleaning the blood from his mouth with quiet precision. The medic tried to make conversation. "You took that hit like a soldier," but Eric didn't respond. He wasn't ignoring the man. He simply couldn't afford the luxury of small talk. The door clicked again. Officer Jalen Verk stepped in, taller than Eric remembered, with a lean build and sharp eyes that missed little. He held a tablet in one hand and a folded document in the other. "Dr. Lindor," he began, voice measured but laced with urgency, "we've got preliminary confirmations. Both men are refusing to speak, but facial and behavioral pattern matching identifies them as part of an extraction network, off books, privately contracted. This wasn't personal. It was bought." Eric didn't flinch. He placed the briefcase on the table in front of him, input a 6-digit code, then twisted a side latch embedded near the handle. The case opened with a soft hydraulic release. Inside, nestled in titanium housing, was a single encrypted data chip. "Vajekstepid Kloser." "So that's what all this was about." Eric nodded, his voice low. "The chip contains audit data proving algorithmic interference in passenger behavior scores, patterns manipulated to target specific profiles, especially during transit scans. One corporation's doing it to sell predictive security contracts worldwide. If this data leaks, their entire model collapses." Verk blinked, then exhaled slowly. "And they knew you were delivering it?" "They knew the timing, not the location," Eric answered. "That's what worries me." Verk tapped the tablet absently, absorbing the weight of the information. "We'll need secure off-site storage and a federal handoff for anything at this level." "You'll have it," Eric said. He closed the briefcase again with a click and leaned back slightly, the sharp ache in his lip now pulsing in rhythm with his thoughts. He'd kept his composure through the cabin assault, through the unraveling conspiracy in the aisle, and through the landing chaos. But now, alone in a metal box of silence, the true scale of the breach began to crystallize. Someone high up had given clearance to intercept a midair. Someone with access, leverage, and no fear of consequences. There was a knock at the inner door. Another officer stepped in briefly to hand Verk a small data slate. Verk scanned it, then looked up. "You should know your attackers weren't traveling under aliases. Their credentials checked out. Real names, real records. That kind of confidence means backing." Eric's eyes narrowed. Or disposal. They were meant to be caught. The air between them thickened with new implications. The failed assault may have been theater, a smokescreen for something more damaging waiting further down the chain. Eric knew this wouldn't end with arrests on the tarmac. Hours passed. Statements were recorded. Security footage was backed up. Passenger testimonies flooded in, each reinforcing the sequence, each proving Eric's restraint and the coordinated nature of the attack. But no names came up, no sponsors, just blank trails and false leads. Finally, Verk returned with a slight nod. "We're moving you. Full escort. From here to an internal operations vehicle, then straight to central compliance. No media, no terminal exposure." Eric stood, the briefcase held tightly at his side. The officers fell in around him as they exited the room. Down the hall, lights flickered across emergency signage and polished floors. Outside, the night air waited. As the doors to the tarmac opened, dozens of passengers, those who had been on the flight, stood scattered behind a roped perimeter. Some clapped softly. Others simply nodded in silent respect. Many held phones, but none interrupted his path. It was clear they had seen what he endured and how he endured it. Verk opened the transport door and gestured him inside. "One last thing," he said as Eric stepped up. "What happens now?" Eric looked ahead at the city glowing past the fence line, lights blinking like signals in fog. His voice was quiet but firm. "Now I take this to the summit, and then I make sure everyone who funded this learns what it means to be exposed." Verk nodded once, solemn. The door shut. The vehicle rolled forward. Eric leaned back into the seat, exhaustion trying to catch him, but clarity kept him awake. He had survived the plane. He had outmaneuvered the operatives. He had protected the chip. But now came the harder part, unveiling the truth in a world designed to bury it. He whispered, barely audible above the hum of the engine, "The flight was only the first battle. Now comes the real fight." The CEO struck back, breaking the flight attendant's nose against the armrest, leaving the cabin frozen and the aggressor stunned. If you believe real authority defends dignity decisively and without delay, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.